Two heavyweights ended with a 3-0 win to Manchester City in the first leg of the Champions League quarter-final. The XG showed City did have the higher quality chances, however, despite the scoreline, between two top managerial minds was fascinating. But what exactly were the tactics employed by Pep and Tuchel? Let's take a look, starting with City on the ball. And in prior matches, when we've seen City line up with this back four, Stones has started at right back and then inverted infield alongside Rodri to create a double pivot. This was still the end result. However, rather than being a right back who inverted, he instead started as a centre back who would then push up into the midfield, so that Akanji was the widest centre back down the right hand side. And when out of possession, Bayern set up in a 4-2-3-1. And rather than always be overly aggressive in pressing, they instead looked to keep their wingers fairly narrow. And this was because they are aware of the City midfield box, which overloads most three-man midfields on the build-up, and Tuchel wanted to avoid that. So, by keeping his wingers this narrow, they were almost effectively central midfielders, so that Bayern now in fact had the man advantage. So here we see Coman is narrower, more concerned with Akanji, as well as De Bruyne high in the half space, while Sane from here could press Ake or Gundogan deeper, but is willing to leave Grealish free out wide, as his main priority is compacting the space. And from here, with Gnabry pressing the central centre-back in Diaz, he would go wide to one side or the other, and once he did, the winger would then spring forward to press, and crucially, Musiala would cover one of the pivots, and the far side winger would cover the secondary pivot, so that again they still had a 4 versus 4 against City's midfield box and would not be overloaded. And with the fullback pushing high up, City were often forced backwards. So here we see one such example where Diaz had the ball, so Coman was wider ready to press Ake, meaning that Sane came infield on Stones. As the ball was played wide, Sane was now pressing on Akanji, which was the trigger for Coman to move in onto the second pivot. So in these scenarios, City would look to drop one of Stones or Rodri deeper, with the goal being to draw Musiala or one of the other midfielders higher up into the press, creating more space in the midfield. And as a man dropped deeper, Haaland would also drop into the midfield, looking to provide the extra option for progression. And he may not be the most aesthetic with his link-up play, but he still did a good job of holding up the play and looking to find runners in and around him. Alternatively, they could instead be more aggressive with their centre-backs, either the wide centre-backs.
If you're like me, someone who was born in a different country but decided to move to Bahrain to chase a better life,
or even Diaz himself, and look to drive past the pressing man as they had the natural 3 versus 2 advantage. And once this occurred, it would draw a man from higher up the pitch, either allowing them to play through the centre, or if it was a winger committing, freeing up a wide centre-back to then move into the space. But the flanks were key for City, and a key focus for them was looking to orchestrate 1v1s. And increasingly we saw the half-space men look to overload the wide regions as they were struggling to pick up the ball in these regions. So when the wide centre-back got onto the ball and drew a man, De Bruyne or Gundogan, depending on which side the play was occurring, could move wide. And at times, the midfielder could track with them, but with Haaland dropping deep, this could be trickier at times. So if they did find this space, they could then potentially look to play in the winger, or De Bruyne in particular would often then look for crosses into the box, with Grealish, Gundogan and Haaland often overload in the box when he was looking to do so. Here we see one such example, with Akanji receiving the ball and this draws Coman. Goretzka was covering De Bruyne when he moved wide, and Davies is drawn towards the dropping Bernardo. But this creates the space for De Bruyne to attack, and Goretzka doesn't immediately follow. So De Bruyne gets into a great position for a cross. This was a different situation where the midfield tracking was more effective. Again, Sane drawn to the wide centre-back, and Gundogan identifies that space, but Goretzka follows him closely. However, this still left the ball over the top open, and Bernardo gets in. And again, getting the 1v1s for the wingers was key, with both of them being crucial in this match, completing the joint most dribbles. So from these scenarios, City could look for the switch to create that isolation once again. This was because with the midfielder having moved wide, the whole of the Bayern Munich midfield could be drawn across. That, combined with the man in the half space drawing in the fullback, as well as the far side winger, as we discussed, defending narrow rather than wide, ready to press the centre back or cover the half space, meant that the far side winger would consistently be free to receive the switch, then have the 1 versus 1. Here both Coman and Sane are fairly narrow, and as we discussed, City could be aggressive with their centre backs and Diaz moves forward. Davies was on Gundogan in the half space, so Diaz commits the switch. And now there's a 1v1. Grealish enjoyed similar situations because the ball was on the right, and once again we see that Coman was narrow, covering the half space, or Ake, so Rodri can go for that switch to Grealish. And now there's a 1v1. But the game was actually won and lost when Bayern were in possession, and Tuchel actually had some great plans for the Bavarians that were outdone by moments in the game. So let's take a closer look at Bayern in possession and City's interesting defense. Much like City, Bayern built in a back three that could look like this, with Pavard coming in off the flank. And City were more aggressive than Bayern in their press, also looking to press with the front three, and this was through Haaland, Grealish coming in off the flank on Pavard, and De Bruyne was often tasked with pushing high up on the right hand side, whilst Rodri and Gundogan would look to back up this press, with Bernardo deeper covering the aggressive Davies. But this shape was causing serious problems for Manchester City in the defensive phase, as not only was this 3 versus 2 in the midfield bad enough, but Gnabry was not operating as a proper forward, and instead would look to drop in alongside Musiala, so often they had a 4 versus 2 against the City midfield, forcing the centre backs at times to come out of position, though this would be risky with the pace of Sane and Coman attacking. This natural overload was also paired with extreme fluidity from Bayern Munich, with the front four all comfortable switching into different zones. So the end result of this is that Bayern were consistently able to find men between the lines who could then turn and run at the City backline. So here we see that City front three on the Bayern back three, Bernardo deeper on Davies, and Rodri and Gundogan are being aggressive on the natural double pivot. In this case, when Musiala drops deep, Stones does follow, but of course that means either Sane or Coman are 1v1 with Akanji, and with City's high line there would be space to play into. And actually in these scenarios, Upamecano was given a lot of responsibility on the ball, having the most touches for Bayern, and he would at times be tasked to carry the ball into the midfield, past the pressing man, in order to increase the numerical advantage in the midfield. And this actually worked well until it didn't. Here's an example of it actually working well with the City front three pressing. Upamecano gets past Haaland pretty easily, and now Grealish has to deal with him, so Pavard would potentially be free to receive down the outside. And here's where we had a great tit for tat between Tuchel and Pep. To deal with these potential overloads, City would at times shift to more of a 4-4-2, with De Bruyne and Haaland being the highest up, but being passive on the double pivots, hopefully allowing Gundogan and Gnabry to be deeper on their men. Bayern would instantly respond, as Davies could now be more aggressive down the outside, as could Pavard down the right hand side. And what this would mean is now both wingers also have the freedom to join in these central zones, meaning that there was still an overload in the central regions. Alternatively, what Bayern could do was play down one side of the pitch, draw the forwards, and force the pivots to come across, meaning that the far side 10 would be free in the midfield to potentially receive. So Guardiola knew he had to react to this new structure from Bayern Munich. So Pep still pressed with the 3, but he changed the personnel of his press, which changed everything. So instead of having De Bruyne joining Grealish and Haaland high up the pitch, it was now Bernardo Silva who from the right hand side would push up, and this would allow De Bruyne to remain deeper, especially looking to tie up Kimmich, who could at times be more of a single pivot. This meant that they had a lot more midfield cover in the central zones, meaning that a centre back could cover more efficiently. This was made possible because, as we know, Bernardo has amazing work rate, so he was entrusted to do this two-man job of both covering De Ligt and dropping deep onto Davies whenever possible. But Tuchel identified an opportunity immediately and looked to take advantage of the new structure from City. This could be in situations when Bernardo was too central on his press, meaning that Davies could receive in space, and then look to combine with Coman or Sane, and he could then overlap down the flank. Or what could happen is that when Davis received in this space, Akanji would be forced to confront him, which meant that the back three would then have to shift across to cover, and with Grealish having been high on Pavard, this would mean the switch to the far side winger, be it Sane or Coman, was on. So in this case, Haaland and De Bruyne have actually rotated, but the principle is the same, with Grealish, the third man, and Bernardo looking to press the Bayern front three, meaning that Davis is free down the flank. So when Davis receives, Akanji has to confront him, meaning that Stones is now dragged onto Sane. So with Grealish high on Pavard, Coman can now receive out here, and with Pavard underlapping, it leads to a dangerous scenario. But Tuchel found yet another way he could exploit this City pressing shape, and this was by still using a back three, but now, rather than having it composed of Pavard, Upamecano and De Ligt, Kimmich would often drop in to be the central centre-back, pushing Upamecano wide, and Pavard would operate more as a traditional right-back. What this meant is that Haaland was now on Kimmich, and Grealish was on Upamecano, meaning now Pavard was the free man outside who could receive and then look to progress the play, leading to dangerous scenarios. So here we see just that, Grealish on Upamecano and Haaland is on Kimmich. Pavard has immediately identified this space and looks to push higher up. So Kimmich then drives high and switches the ball to Pavard, who has plenty of room to attack. Overall, from a tactical level, these two managers have once again brought the best out of each other, with City coming out on top and taking a healthy lead to the Allianz. And Tuchel would count himself unlucky because almost all of the goals were a result of sloppy play rather than tactical